The problem is to identify invalid transactions. Given an array of transactions in the form of string, a transaction is invalid if its amount is greater than 1000 or if it occurs with 60 minutes of another transaction by the same person in a different city. The given code implements a solution to this problem using a class named transaction to store transaction details and two methods named invalidTransaction and isValid to identify invalid transaction. The transaction class has four fields: name, time, amount, and city. It also has a constructor that takes a string as input and split it into the four fields. The invalid transaction method takes an array of transaction string as input, create a map of transaction for each person, and check if each transaction is valid by calling the isValid method. If a transaction is invalid, it is added to the list of invalid transactions. The isValid method takes a transaction and a list of transactions by the same name as input and check if the transaction is valid. To solve this problem, you can follow the following steps. The input to the problem is an array of strings representing transactions where each transaction string has a format, name, time, amount, and city. The goal is to identify and return a list of all the transactions that are considered invalid based on two criteria. A transaction is invalid if its amount exceeds 1000. A transaction is invalid if there is another transaction with the same name with 60 minutes of its time in a different city. The invalid transaction method in the code takes an array of transactions string and return a list of invalid transactions by calling the isValid method on each transaction. The isValid method takes a transaction and a list of all transactions with the same name and check if the transaction is valid based on two criteria. If the transaction is found to be invalid, it is added to the list of invalid transactions. Finally, the method returns the list of invalid transactions. The program defined a nested class called transaction that is to parse each transaction string and store the transaction information in the field. The map variable is a hash map that is used to group transaction by name. The main method in the program creates an instance of a invalid transaction class. Call the invalid transaction method on an array of two transactions and print the result list of invalid transactions.